Welcome to Penn State Dickinson Law's Profiles in Leadership series. My name is Daryl Lim. I serve as the H. Letty Montauk Junior Chair and Associate Lead for Research and Innovation at the Law School. This series offers an opportunity to glean insights from top leaders in their fields. In each episode, we invite these leaders to reflect on their journeys and share skills, core values, and qualities that make them the leaders they are today. We're very pleased to have Dave Kappos with us. Dave is co-chair of the intellectual property practice at Cravath, Swaine Moore. He is widely recognized as one of the most foremost leaders in intellectual property, including IP management and strategy, the development of global IP norms, laws, and practices, and the commercialization and enforcement of innovation-based assets. He supports Cravath's clients with a wide range of their most complex IP issues, including blockchain, crypto assets, fintech, data security, and privacy. He served as Undersecretary of Commerce and Director of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. In that role, he advised the President, the Secretary of Commerce, and the administration on IP policy matters. As USPTO Director, he led the agency in re-engineering its management and operational systems and engagement with the global innovation community. He was instrumental in achieving the greatest legislative reform of the U.S. patent system in generations through the passage and implementation of the Leahy-Smith America Invents Act, which President Obama signed into law in 2011. He held several executive posts in IBM's legal department, including litigation counsel, Asia Pacific IP counsel, and vice president and chief IP lawyer responsible for all patent, trademark, copyright, and trade secret matters worldwide. Welcome.
Yeah, great to see you, Daryl. Thank you for having me on.
Let's start with your IBM career and reflect on the early years at IBM. What leadership lessons did you learn as you transitioned from an engineer to legal and IP strategist there?
Yeah, so IBM in those days, and I don't know, they may still, but I can only talk about when I was there, invested a lot in developing leadership skills. And so from early on in my tenure as a lawyer, I had a lot of training in leadership, literally like programs at Harvard Business School, and bringing in leadership trainers from other business schools around the country, in fact, around the world, I can remember. And early lessons, what I would tell you, first of all, empathy. I learned early on the importance as a leader and a manager of putting yourself in the position of the other person that you're interacting with. So that's one thing that comes to mind. The other one is well, relatedly, a bit of forbearance that's involved in management and leadership. In other words, recognizing that the people that you're leading may not be in a position to respond or react or follow you as quickly as you would like them to. And so recognizing that everyone moves at their own speed and again, meeting people where they are is a super important skill for leaders to learn. And I can remember that, learning that at IBM very early on. And then I guess, Daryl, the one other thing, and these are all very soft skills that I'm mentioning right now. I'm sure later on we'll talk about sort of harder leadership skills. But the other one that comes to mind for me is, recognizing that a lot of leadership is about what I'll refer to here as sort of normative understanding. In other words, in interacting with people and trying to marshal humans to do things better, faster, more, improve their skills, all the things that leaders try to do, follow, organize, all of that. It's super important to understand that if someone, says they're feeling something or they've got some concern, it doesn't matter actually whether you agree with them or not. The fact that they have a concern in their mind is, normatively really critical, and you have to understand you got to deal with it, not by dismissing it, not by saying it's invalid, not by saying, you can't have that concern, but by accepting it and dealing with it as whatever it is, as something that's valid because this person is feeling with it. And so those sort of soft skills and human understanding come to mind for me as early lessons that I learned, transitioning from being an individual contributor, who obviously could get lots of things done, into a person who's charged with getting other people to get things done, who may work at different rates or think things through differently or have different concerns than I did or than you do as a leader.
Thanks. So it was striking when I was looking at that time that you were at IBM, how much international work you did, and in particular focused on Asia. You've since been very active still in Asia. I see you there from time to time. What has that period of your life taught you in terms of leadership, about engaging the world, being part of a different community? And if you like, talk a little bit about what that means for IP policy as well.
Yeah, well, that was for me, the period in which I lived in Japan and managed IBM's IP operations, really from, Pakistan in the south and west, all the way over to the international date line. I think 43 or 45 countries total, something like that. And traveling all the time and traveling constantly to countries in which you don't speak the language, you don't read the writing in general, you don't understand the cultures, and trying to be effective and get things done in that environment, for me, required a transition from being a citizen of a country, in my case the US, to being a global citizen. Someone who can almost literally parachute into any environment and quickly start to appreciate what's going on around you, and find ways to be effective and to accomplish ends, and especially to listen and watch very carefully for the signs involved in human interactions of how things are going and what you should expect. And there was a lot of preparation, I can remember, that for me was involved in understanding customs and expectations in various countries to avoid making mistakes, but also to be able to be effective. And that's what, I put that all under the label of global citizenship, being able to operate in many different cultural environments, and be effective in those environments. Now, how does that relate to IP? Well, IP is interesting and unusual in legal norms, in that it is one of the legal areas that is, the most consistent between countries. Not to say that it's, perfectly consistent. It's not, but we benefit from having, treaties going back in some cases into the 19th century, copyright treaties and trademark treaties and patent treaties, that and built up norms and practices between patent offices and trademark offices and copyright offices going back generations, that enable IP to be, in a way, kind of an international language. So, the IP component for me of global citizenship has always been and remains today. And I'm very active in substantive patent law harmonization, SPLH, it's still called, and trying to get, hard patent law issues like obviousness and definition of prior art, and things like collision of similar patent applications, and nuanced topics like self-collision and anti-self-collision, trying to work those things out. Those are all about understanding the history of and the culture of different countries and how they think about the patent system, the trademark system, the copyright system. And I learned that from spending a lot of time in countries in Asia in those days, a lot of time in China, a lot of time I lived in Japan, so I spent a lot of time there, a lot of time in Korea, Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore, Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand, India, and assimilating not just the laws as they stood, but the reasons for them, how they are rooted in culture, concerns, issues of individual countries and regions, and trying to work out then with the leadership there, again, on their terms, and address their concerns, not just my concerns, in order to figure out how to move aspects of harmonization forward. And I carried that forward into my time in the government, and then ever since, and including up to today, working on these issues.
Do you think we have lost that ability to transmit and interact at multiple frequencies? Because I think of the US's leadership with TRIPS, for example, and many other leading international instruments. And then we have, perhaps in the last 20 years, that seems to have waned somewhat. And you see, for example, the Beijing Treaty I just heard the other day. Yes, the US was involved in it, but they'll probably never implement it. And where are we today in terms of US leadership on international IP issues?
I think that struggles. The Beijing Treaty, along with the Print Disabled Treaty, and one other I'm forgetting right now, were three treaties that we negotiated during the first Obama term, when those of us who were at the patent office were very focused on helping, and U.S. leadership and U.S. Stewardship, I think I would call it, of new treaties that would be helpful to many across the planet. Print Disabled Treaty, was a treaty about the U.S. leading the world in accepting actually some exceptions to the copyright regime. And it was a difficult one because in some developed countries like the U.S., there is a vibrant print disabled industry, and there are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of titles that are available to the visually disabled, right? The print disabled community. So it wasn't a problem for the US. So people from the publishing industry were in there asking us, what are you guys doing? Why are you leading in negotiating this treaty that's not really needed in the US? And the answer was, it's not because it's needed in the US, it's because the US needs to lead for the world in helping print disabled people in countries where there is not an industry to serve them, where they are disadvantaged. And we got that done, as well as the Beijing Treaty, Daryl, which you mentioned. Now, implementation and getting, in the case of the US, under our Constitution, Congress to ratify treaties is another thing. And that typically does span, generations and administrations, and some of it's gotten done since then in terms of ratification, and some of it hasn't. Would I say that the US has fallen off on leadership in that regard? I don't know. There's been some recent treaty activity in the last administration, although, there are questions about, about whether it's really good for the world in honestly addressing, topics of concern, or whether it's just sort of masking other issues. I don't know, frankly, what the right answer is there. I think, Daryl, to your question, though, the jury's still out on U.S. leadership. But it is, I would tell you, it's more in doubt now than I think it was, 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Thanks. That's a good segue actually to talk about the incoming USPTO director. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but we do know that you had left a fine blueprint for thinking about leadership at the USPTO. So you wrote or co-wrote a number of papers, building a service-oriented agency, lessons from USPTO, tenets for successful 21st century government agency, and built to last. What a title there, built to last. The tenets for a successful 21st century government agency. What lessons would you highlight from those papers for the incoming USPTO director?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Again, coming from IBM, and by the time I entered the USPTO, I had been the chief IP lawyer at IBM for around 7 years or so. And so a huge investment in leadership. I can't count how much the company and I, tremendously thank IBM for this level of investment. But my view of my time at the USPTO was, we're going to transform this agency from a kind of a doormat of the federal government. And I'm not sure if you can see behind me, but there's a poster over there that shows, I don't know if I can actually, yeah, you can see now.
Number one.
Camera.
I see that big number one there.
But perhaps the most important thing is to realize, if you can see the very bottom where the PTO started, it was number 172, I think. And so was it the worst? That's 172 out of about 220 large agencies in the federal government. So it wasn't the very worst agency in the federal government, but it was in the bottom quartile. And so my view was, look, you're never going to get excellent accomplishment, achievement, excellent results, excellent quality out of any group of individuals, government agency, department, clan, whatever, family, whatever, unless you can, get them organized and address underlying causes. And we, did manage to do that, as you point out. And by 2013, right, got the agency to be the very best agency in the federal government, number one, which was kind of a stunning achievement and not something we really set out to do. What we set out to do was to change the culture and to improve dramatically capability, achievement, accomplishment, right, all of that. And so, back to your question, what were the lessons, or what would I have to say to the incoming director to do that? Look, it's not about any one thing. It's about a lot of little things. Starting with, you've got to be present. You've got to be at the agency, and you've got to be focusing on its people, and at all levels. And that starts with the people who greet you when you come into the parking garage, and the people who greet you when you come into the building, all the way up to frankly, your principals at the Department of Commerce and in the administration. They're part of the PTO, constituency as well, in a way. And of course, all the applicants for patents and attorneys and representatives of them. And it requires being there, and it requires listening, and then it requires acting. And, and I don't know if there's time to go into a lot of the specifics about, things that one can do to make those,
go for it if you like,
into those lofty concepts. But that would be, sort of number one, what I would say. And I'll give you one quick story on that. For me, it started even before I was confirmed. So I knew when I was nominated for the job that the PTO has three powerful unions. Some of the most powerful in the federal government, including the Patent Office Professional Association, POPA, which is actually feared among government unions for its tenacity and its success in repeatedly beating management in the USPTO on important issues like, work conditions for patent examiners, compensation, reward systems, those kinds of things. Computer access, ability to work from home, those kinds of issues. And so once I was nominated for a job, then you start traveling down to DC on a weekly basis to meet with senators and members of the administration and all of that. And I made it a point of reaching out to the presidents of all three of those unions and scheduling meetings with them while I was in DC and sitting down with them in person and asking them a simple question. Look, if I get this job, tell me three things I can do that I can do under my authority. I don't have to get a law. I don't have to go, and get the president's authorization or anything like that. That would be good for the union, but also good for our country. I mean, I'm not talking about throwing a party here, right? I'm talking about things that are actually going to advance your ability to do a good job that will be defensible, to our entire constituency. And to their credit, all three of them came up with items, and I literally, it's not that complicated, sat there, took notes, wrote them down. And then, when I got into the job, on my first few days, I had meetings in, the director's office there at the PTO and said, okay, here's what you told me you wanted to do. Are you still on board with this? And yes was the answer. And we just went and did those things. Not hard, all doable, all pretty straightforward. And that started a new cycle, turning from distrust, disbelief, confrontation, opposition to gradually, from that first step, and then many steps coming after it, move to shared objectives, shared philosophies and principles, and a collaborative environment that enabled us to do what you see on the board behind you. That wasn't anything any one person could do. You had to get important groups to go along, starting with the unions, to work with you. And that was what we did. So what is that? That's listening to people. That's asking them what they need. And then that's doing it, going out and actually doing it for them. And that is like leadership 101, to turn from a dysfunctional situation gradually over a functional one. But again, Daryl, as I said at the beginning of this one, you can't do it if you're traveling around the world, walking on red carpets. You got to actually be there. Many don't remember. In fact, I'm not sure there's anyone who's still living who remembers. But I made it a point in, when you get confirmed, started the job, then you get sworn in on the first morning so you can actually do your job. The Secretary of Commerce, by tradition, comes over and holds like a ceremonial swearing in then when it's convenient, a few weeks later. And Gary Locke, who was then my boss, came over and did that. There's, a couple thousand people gathered on the quad there at the PTO. And of course, you have to give a speech. The sort of key point in my speech was, I'm going to be here, right? I'm going to show up at this place and work with you. And I simply did that, including walking the halls, including showing up on weekends when it was the end of a bye week, which is when a lot of examiners were in the office. And I, would bring in like a bag of candy and just stop by examiners' offices and say, hey, really appreciate what you're doing. Can I offer you a little chocolate to keep going during the day? So just, a ton of little things like that that require being there and demonstrating, direct contact leadership on a sustained basis. And I said that in my speech that day on the PTO quad, and then I went and did it. So that's the long answer to your.
That's a great angle. Thanks for sharing that. Can I ask you quickly about that moment that you were sworn in? Because that picture actually is on your Wikipedia page with your wife Leslie and Secretary Locke, and your hand was on a Bible swearing. Can you talk a little bit about your family and your faith and what that has to do with informing how you see yourself as a leader?
Yeah. So that goes back a little bit further. I come from a big family. Both of my parents are immigrants. I'm actually first generation American. My dad immigrated from Greece when he was a young boy. And I have 6 brothers and sisters. So, in sort of middle class upbringing, nothing at all fancy. I, paid to go to college myself and all that. So, I feel like I never, my parents did a great job of bringing 7 kids up, but, never really had any particular advantage over anybody else. And as the second to youngest of 7 kids, you sort of get used to negotiating to stay alive as a young child in a large family. And having to sort of do things on your own, you get used to, some level of diplomacy skills and sizing up situations and, recognizing what it takes to turn what otherwise could be an unsuccessful outcome into a successful outcome, and adapting in the moment, right, and reading the room and all that kind of stuff. So I think my family upbringing got me into that mode from a very early age, and just, growing up in that environment. And in terms of, faith later in life, for me, it's really all about trying to help develop other people, and empower other people. And that in turn involves, again, I've never figured out like a way to do this at scale. For me, involves a lot of retail. It involves spending time with people, listening to them, trying to be genuinely helpful to them. And that for me is the sort of basic tenet of faith. The other thing, Daryl, that I learned at IBM, and there's a faith component to this, which is the leader who views herself or himself as a servant. And there's some good literature on this, including from a Russian leadership expert who himself, had a deep faith component to his style and writing. And I've over the years have followed his work. And the theme of it all is that, leadership is service. And as a leader, you cannot view yourself as the superstar or the celebrity, and frame the accomplishments as my accomplishments. They're not. They're our accomplishments, and you have to view yourself as a servant of the people, who are the employees. In the case of the USPTO, the career civil service employees. There was a book that came out shortly before I was in the USPTO, written by a guy who was involved in the remaking of the Ritz-Carlton brand. And it was all about, great service. And actually, bought that book for every member of the senior leadership team at the PTO. And we, one of the things that we created when I was there was a senior executive service called SES, and the PTO's got about 50, at least then it had about 50 SES members. So these are civil service executives. So we had the SES group, and we'd meet on I think, quarterly basis. And I insisted on planning the agenda and running the meetings myself. So this is standing up in front of people for, 2, 3 or more hours, and leading conversations and asking questions and answering questions. And we had the guy who wrote that book about the Ritz-Carlton service come in one time and speak to us. And the whole theme of that piece of work, and again, back to the larger service philosophy, was that, leadership is about service. It's not about other people serving you, it's about you serving them. And if you've got that in your head, your agency or your company or whatever can do really great things. And if you don't, you're going to have more trouble getting people to follow you. Not that it's impossible, but it becomes harder. So that's hopefully an answer to the kind of faith question.
Thanks. That's a great answer. Talking about something great that you did at the USPTO. Well, you managed to pass, as I mentioned in my introduction, the America Invents Act under your leadership at the USPTO. That's a phenomenal achievement of leadership, because I can only imagine how many constituents you had to bring together for that passage of the act. Much has been said about the substance of the act, but I just want to focus for the purposes of this conversation on the leadership part of it and how you stewarded that act from start to finish.
Well, yes, thanks, Daryl. The AIA was indeed, I think a big accomplishment for the Obama administration, for the first Obama administration. And I would say, I definitely do not take credit for, being like a mastermind on that. There were a lot of people at the PTO who did great work. And I would start with the president. We were able to get President Obama involved. Secretary Locke was key to getting President Obama involved and willing to make calls and champion the AIA. Secretary Locke was heavily involved. He hosted for us, for the PTO, quiet breakfast meetings early in the mornings in the run-up to trying to get the AIA through its committee hearings and markups and then floor votes, bringing in key senators and talking to them about the bill and getting them comfortable and listening to them. And then, it was my job and our job at the PTO to go and implement changes, work with staff, both houses of Congress, to fix issues so that the bill could advance. So it was definitely a team effort. It started at the top with huge credit to the president, huge credit to the Secretary of Commerce, and then our whole team at PTO. And we had from the legislative affairs folks to the solicitor's office to the patents group. We had a really well integrated, well-oiled machine of super smart people who were all over, helping congressional staff, listening to constituent issues, from the independent inventors who were worried about losing, the first to invent system, the people who were worried about the PTO having control to set its own fees, the people who were concerned about the putting in place, a statutory ability to advance patent applications to the top of the queue by, selecting track one. There are many components to the AIA that were super positive policy. Of course, everybody's long since forgotten about them because they totally worked. They were totally great. They're now totally non-controversial. And of course, 10, 12, whatever it is now, 13 years later, all the focus is on, the things that have turned out to be challenging to implement. I think the PTAB is probably at the top of that list. But it all happened, and it really was a huge piece of work because of teamwork across the PTO and the ability to go anywhere and do anything. I'm going to give you an example of that. A key player then, if I remember, I was Harry Reid, the senator from Nevada. And Senator Reid, again, if I'm doing this from memory, so I hope I'm remembering it all correctly and names and all that, and states, had a very vocal independent inventor group based in Reno that was petitioning hard because they were super concerned about losing the first to invent system, right, which the US was alone in the world at that point. And I was of the view, longstanding view, that the first to invent system is a shibboleth. It doesn't really work that way. And the US needs to harmonize on a first to file standard. And so Harry Reid's chief of staff called up just as I was getting ready to leave for Easter, talking about faith, to go spend the Easter holiday with my family, and said, I need you to go to Reno and meet with this independent inventor group because, they're really very concerned. And, I think it's going to take the PTO director going out there and meeting with them in person to have them understand what we're doing here and how it's going to be helpful to them. So did that. that was an Easter, weekend trip to beautiful Reno, Nevada, at a time of year when, kind of in between ski season and summer in Reno then. But I give that as an example because it was, we never would have been in a position to do that had we not had totally fluid communications going with the key stakeholders in Congress, that they knew who to, where to call, who to call, what to ask for, and they knew that it would get done. They had the confidence to say, okay, we can send these guys and they will go get it done, and we did. And so that, to me, Daryl, is how the AIA got done. Like a lot of a lot of little things, not showing up for any one red carpet thing, but being there constantly and being ready to prioritize, drop whatever else you're doing, go where you need to go, in order to address whatever the issue is, large or small. A small independent inventor group in Reno, Nevada, who would have known? But that turned out to be key.
Thanks. And you are still leading on IP policy as Citizen Kappos. You, along with others, set up C4IP, and it's a remarkable grassroots effort, and if I understand correctly, quite focused on grassroots and connecting grassroots with the legislative effort in Congress. Can you talk about how you see this effort as a leader? Talk about the strategies that you use to influence policymakers to move in a direction that you think they should be moving, but also talk about the trust that you alluded to that was so instrumental with the AIA and how you bring that into your leadership efforts at C4IP.
There are a lot to unpack there. So, you leave the job at the PTO, and I won't try and speak for others, but for me, I left with a view, I owe a pretty huge debt to our country and to everyone who invested faith in me to lead and to try and help this agency. And you've got to then think of yourself. I feel that I have a debt that I've got to pay back over the rest of my life, actually. And it's again, a debt of service and stewardship to the system, to advocating in favor of strong and effective intellectual property rights on behalf of our country and indeed the world. And nobody pays me to do it. This is all totally pro bono, and it's many hundreds of hours a year. It occupies a lot of weekend time, but that's the debt that you owe from being privileged and fortunate enough to have that job really for any period of time. And C4IP is one part of, if you will, repaying that debt, or the lifetime stewardship that I feel those of us who have had the opportunity to lead important government agencies, not just the PTO, it's every other agency of government. I hope people who have that rare opportunity then view themselves as lifetime stewards of whatever it is their expertise or their agency is. And so for me, that has meant writing. I don't keep count, but it's got to be hundreds of articles that I've published at this point since being at the PTO. Just trying to call balls and strikes and be honest and truthful about things. Being constantly meeting, not as a lobbyist, but as an unpaid expert with members of Congress, with congressional staff, with members of the administration. And I feel lucky they still call on me, very regularly. Leading individual efforts. For me, one of them has been substantive patent law harmonization, which we mentioned before. And I got a lot more coming up on that, all volunteer and super important long-term stuff. Patent law eligibility, which I'm sure you're aware, Daryl, is an effort that I've personally led since 2019, when now the late, great Don Dunner leaned over to me after a particularly frustrating conference we were both speaking at and said, Dave, somebody's got to get this done. Will you do it? Here we are, whatever it is. I think it might have been even 2017. So we're talking about, 7 or so years later, still working on that, and on and on and on. And it's all about, the debt that we owe and being a steward of the system. And trying to be, and coming to the tail part of your question, Daryl, trying to honor the trust that's placed in us and has been placed in me by being true to it and being willing to be honest. When things are going really well, and say that, and when things aren't going so well, and say that as well, and to help try and encourage people who are balanced, not just representing any one extreme point of view, but who see lots of different points of view to be involved in the system. So that's where I feel like the post-government service is an ongoing and lifelong commitment and responsibility that we have.
Thanks. In terms of mentorship, do you see C4IP's role in mentoring, identifying emerging leaders in IP and building that coalition for the next generation?
Yeah. I mean, for C4IP, absolutely. And leaders in lots of different places, leaders in Congress, House and Senate. So trying to find candidates and members who are helpful to the strong and effective development of strong and effective intellectual property rights, and championing their candidacy or their continued service in Congress, finding and developing people in the administration, finding and developing people at the patent office, finding and developing people in the academy. And C4IP is working on all of those things. But for me, it's not just C4IP. I'm personally working on all of those things as a citizen also, in addition to through C4IP. So, everything that develops the next generation of leaders. I'll give you another example. I'm the chair of the Naples Patent Institute, called the Naples Roundtable, which is a group of patent experts that convenes a 2-day conference every winter in Naples, Florida. Nice destination that time of year. The purpose of one purpose of the Naples Roundtable is to develop the next generation of leadership in the intellectual property area. So we're constantly inviting congressional staffers and recent college graduates and new members of the academy and et cetera to join in that conference. And why? In order to develop the next generation of leadership. AIPLA does a great job of that as well. IPO, and I'm very active in both of those organizations, does a great job of developing the next generation of leaders. In fact, I was fortunate to be at the AIPLA annual meeting just last month when a young woman, Victoria Fong, received the Jan Jansen Award for, brilliant new lawyer, just graduated from law school. Victoria, it turns out, is a new junior associate here at Cravath. I didn't have anything to do with her getting that award. She earned it, obviously, all on her own. But the other thing that ties this together for me is Jan Jansen, the person after whom the award is named, was my manager when I was a student starting out at IBM's patent law training program in Crystal City, Virginia, back in the 1980s. So you see how these things come full circle. And the people who were our mentors pass on, of course. And then it's our job to develop the next cadre, including people like Victoria, and those people are now developing.
Thanks. So, last question. Talking about your personal approach to growth and learning, you have developed an expertise and an astounding array of new areas like crypto and AI, and I've heard you talk about these things. How do you grow as a leader? How do you develop this ability to pick things up quickly and to be able to advise on these cutting edge issues? And just end with whatever final thoughts you like to leave with our viewers.
Okay, well, thanks, Charles. So yeah, AI is an area of huge interest to me. It goes back actually to when I was at the patent office. So now we're talking like 15 years ago, and was concerned about the onset of data as an asset class and the lack of an intellectual property regime that addresses data as an asset class. And I'm sorry that the picture is becoming a bit washed out. The sun suddenly has emerged behind me here in New York City.
We can still see you fine.
Okay, so my philosophy on these new technology areas, whether it's fintech, distributed ledger, crypto, AI, right, data as a larger asset class, whatever is, it's all about curiosity. I'm really curious about these new. I'm working on another example that's maybe a little bit more refined even and not on the radar screen is supply chain digitization and globalization, a project that actually has significant Singapore roots and significant Southeast Asia roots. And it's got distributed ledger issues with it, and it's got artificial intelligence issues. But when you get deeply into an area like supply chain and supply chain modernization, you start to realize there's a super curiosity element. And then number two, there's a tremendous view and commitment as to the importance, the criticality of these technologies to solving problems that are vexing to humankind. And that's what makes me, really interested in almost, anything that's new and willing to get into it and interested in digging into the details and understanding the technology, to be able to get to root causes. So that's, kind of a quick answer, Daryl, on the point of, how is it that you get into new stuff? But again, it takes time. I spend a lot of time, studying these areas, reading, thinking about them, speaking with others, learning from others, participating in meetings and conferences, forming and testing new views, right? And then crystallizing them and then trying to advocate for the system, on behalf of the system, those new ideas. And then, lastly, so this is all about leadership. What I would say is we're all leaders, and there's a work that I think you did mention, Daryl, that I haven't finished, but hope to someday finish, which is called Leading Lawyers, that I've worked on from time to time. And it starts from the premise that, lawyers are kind of at the top of the food chain or near the top of the food chain when it comes to professions in terms of the skills, right? Writing skills, oral advocacy skills, reasoning skills, deductive skills, logical skills, principle skills, judgment skills. These are, what make humans humans and what make leaders leaders. So the thesis is, if you're a lawyer, you need to get used to something. You're a leader. Don't walk away from that notion. Don't, no, I'm just, a nobody. No. You are a leader, and you need to act like a leader, and you need to learn leadership skills. And you need to take on the commitment to lead with integrity and to develop other people. Leadership is really a lot about developing other people. Anyway, so that would be my parting thought, Daryl, that as lawyers, we're all leaders. We need to take that on and own that, and we need to do it and do it well and do it in a principled fashion.
Thanks. Leading with integrity, it's all about the people and to do it in an integrated fashion. Thanks so much, Dave, for taking the time to speak to us about leadership on our Profiles in Leadership episode. And we wish you the very best in those endeavors, including finishing up on that last project there.
Many others. And Daryl, thank you for convening this series. I hope it is super successful, and we'll look forward to our next project together.
Thank you. So do I.